Hello ladies and gentlemen, Adri here with GIGABYTE Gaming, bringing you a GIGABYTE review of Kunitsu-Gami Path of the Goddess. This is a new third-person action/tactical real-time strategy game that is both developed and published by Capcom. Released on July 18th for PS4, PS5, Xbox One, Xbox Series S and X, and PC, Kunitsu-Gami provides a highly stylized take on Japanese mythology, which in some ways serves as a spiritual successor to another similar Capcom title, the PS2-era classic hit game Okami. In fact, that connection is made all the more apparent by the optional, and more importantly free, bonus content, which is included with every purchase of the game. This bonus content includes Okami-themed alternate outfits for both of the game's primary protagonists, as well as an optional weapon skin, and access to the Okami soundtrack that can be used as an alternative to the game's base soundtrack. The story is summed up in the opening sequence of the game, detailing how Mount Kafuku, where the events of Kunitsu-Gami take place, is corrupted by a form of evil defilement, which derives from the greedy actions of the mountain's village inhabitants. As a result, the various villages and locales along the face of the mountain have been rendered uninhabitable and left crawling with evil nocturnal creatures, with the villagers of the mountain subsequently trapped within defiled cocoons. This leaves the burden of saving the villagers and the mountain from the spread of the defilement to Yoshiro, a shrine maiden who summons a guardian named Yo to help defend her as she endeavors to purge her home of corruption. The story, while sufficient enough to establish the player's objective over the course of the game, is overall not a very deep one. There's little to no meaningful dialogue that doesn't come in the form of narration. As a result, there's almost no character development beyond what few interactions we see between So and Yoshiro in some of the game's narrative cutscenes. Surprisingly though, the game's ending did leave me feeling a bit of an emotional gut punch, which is fairly impressive given how weak of an impression the story had left on me up to that point. But in the end, a game like Kunitsu-Gami doesn't really need a strong narrative. It's simply not that kind of game. Its true strength comes from its combat and atmosphere. Its stylized art design creates environments that transition from eerie to beautiful as more sections of defilement are gradually purged and locales that were once left in disrepair are rebuilt. There's a true feeling of change and restoration. Although some of the tasks required to rebuild the areas that you reclaim from the corruption are fairly repetitive, and I think that one word, repetitive, can be used to describe much of Kunitsu-Gami's gameplay loop. The standard gameplay loop that you'll find yourself repeating in the game consists of purging a defiled location, which often, though not always, then unlocks a boss fight. Once the boss is defeated, then you unlock the next area of the game that you'll need to purge. Then it's in between all this purging and boss fighting that you can regularly go back to any previously purged villages or locations in order to rebuild them for rewards. The process of purging the various locations you'll visit as you descend the defiled slopes of Mount Kafuku will generally be pretty similar from one area to the next. You'll usually start off with So and Yoshiro on one far end of an area with a long dark path of defilement that leads from the starting point to a corrupted torii gate that serves as the source of the area's corruption. Your objective is to lead Yoshiro along the defiled path by having So carve the corruption from it. This path carving process costs crystals, and as such, you can only carve as much of the path as you have crystals. Once a section of corrupted path is carved, Yoshiro will begin slowly dancing her way toward the torii gate while cleansing the carved section of path of its corruption. Meanwhile, the player can busy themselves as So by exploring the area, purging defiled demon sprout baby things, which provides more crystals, saving villagers from defiled cocoons, removing the corruption from the surrounding wildlife by whacking them, and otherwise preparing to defend Yoshiro from the waves of defiled monsters called the Seethe that will inevitably pour forth from the corrupted torii gate as soon as night falls. One of the most important tasks you can complete as So, in preparation for battle, is to assign your newly freed villagers to various different combat roles. This ranges from frontline melee units, backline ranged units, healers, tanks, and debuff specialists, as well as a variety of other more uniquely specialized roles with a wide range of effects and uses. New roles are gradually unlocked as players defeat bosses and claim their masks. There are 11 masks in total, and thus 11 unlockable combat roles. Assigning a role to a villager costs a set number of crystals, meaning the player must balance their choice of unit composition with their path carving objective. Spend too many crystals on expensive combat roles, and you may end up delaying Yoshido's progress toward the corrupted Torii Gate, which means longer stages and more nighttime fighting phases. Spend too many crystals carving the path for Yoshido, and you may only be able to assign villagers to cheaper, weaker roles that might compromise your ability to defend her from stronger wave attacks. Another thing to consider is that Yoshido cannot make any progress in purging the corrupted path at night, and she can only make so much progress within the span of a given day, which means that carving more path than she can cleanse before nighttime might just be a waste of crystals that could otherwise go toward building a stronger defense. The progress that Yoshido can make within a given day, or based on the limited amount of path that has been carved, is shown as a colored silhouette indicator. This indicator is displayed as blue when indicating that Yoshido will reach the end of the corrupted path before nightfall, thus allowing So to begin the purging process on the corrupted Torii Gate before fighting another wave of enemies. If Yoshido cannot make it to the gate before nightfall, either because the path hasn't completely been carved or because she simply doesn't have enough time to reach the end, her silhouette indicator will be displayed as gray. The player has the option to command Yoshido to stop her progress in order to position her in easier to defend locations. However, she cannot be commanded to move backwards, and wherever she is when night falls is where the player will have to defend her. If Yoshido is killed by seethe enemies, it's game over, meaning the player will have to start their current stage over from the beginning. Ultimately, it's up to the player to find the right balance between progress and defense. There are also a number of special rewards, unlocks, and collectibles that players can acquire during these stages of the game. The most common of them come from the purging of the demon baby things. Any stage in which they can be found will have a set number of them to purge. Once you've cleared them all, a special reward will unlock from a red receptacle, which can then be collected by the player. This usually contains various items, such as Mazo talismans, which are equipable objects that often provide stat increases for So and villager units, and Tsuba guards, which are equipable sword attachments that provide powerful abilities and attacks. Similar rewards can also be acquired via buried treasure and behind locked boxes. These sorts of rewards are only obtainable through the recruitment and use of the Thief class, which is a unique role that players can assign to villagers. The Thief has the ability to dig up chests and pick locks, but cannot be used in combat. However, players can assign a villager to the Thief role during the day in order to collect all the treasure on the map, and then reassign them to a combat role before nightfall. The initial crystals spent to make the villager a thief will be lost when they're reassigned, but said cost is relatively low, and often the number of additional crystals you can obtain from the treasure they collect will more than offset the loss. However, as nice as these additional treasures and unlocks may be, they don't ultimately seem necessary for progression through the game. Once a location's corrupted Torii Gate or gates, depending on if there's one or two in a given location, are purged, the stage is cleared and either a new location will be unlocked for purging, or, as is very often the case, a new boss fight is unlocked on the world map. Boss fights act as their own stage that block progress to further locations and bosses until the current boss is defeated. The boss fights in Kunitsu-Gami are widely varied, with a long roster of unique, interesting enemies. Very rarely did I ever find one encounter similar to another. Some are straightforward battles to the death, utilizing all the basic fundamentals of combat to their fullest, while many others require the use of special strategies and mechanics in order to effectively deal damage. This variation in fight mechanics helps to make each boss battle unique and engaging. Now, to some degree, at this point, it's important to emphasize that while the gameplay loop of Kunitsu-Gami is generally fun and at times varied, there is a noticeable degree of repetition that can wear the experience thin. This is much less so true for the boss battles than it is for the locations you must purify to progress through the game, but it is nonetheless something of an issue that permeates all aspects of the gameplay loop. And probably the worst offender of this repetition is the process of returning to the locations you've purified a defilement, which you usually do in order to access Yoshiro's tent, which we'll discuss more in a bit, and to interact with the base rebuilding process. This consists of approaching sections of a purified zone that are marked with a symbol that indicates that said sections can be rebuilt after the destruction that the Seath wrought on the area. Each rebuilding section offers a reward for completion and requires a set number of villagers and time stages to complete. With these time and villager restrictions, completely rebuilding a given location can take multiple time stages. One time stage amounts to one location cleansed of defilement or one boss fight completed, so completely rebuilding a given location can take a good amount of time. Ultimately, I believe this is likely the portion of Kunitsu-Gami's gameplay loop that most embodies the game's overarching issue of repetition. While this rebuilding process isn't exactly mandatory, as you don't need to complete these side tasks in order to unlock the next sections of the game, often the rewards it provides are very useful, perhaps even a necessary part of the protagonist's soul's gradually increasing power. These include rewards such as upgrade materials and increases to the maximum number of healing items and crystals that Soul can carry with them from one section of the game to the next. Without the upgrades it provides, some of the later sections of the game, including the final boss, might prove too difficult for some players. To at least some degree, these repetitive rebuilding elements that will likely be divisive among the player base may end up being a practical requirement for the completion of the game. However, all of this isn't to say that there's no value in this process. I myself can only speculate what effect skipping these repetitive tasks might have on game progression since, despite their repetitive nature, I found myself determined to complete them all in order to see the visual changes that occur as each location is gradually restored to its pre-defilement state. I found that this beautification process, as redundant as it might be, serves to enhance the sense of restoration that underlies the foundation of the game's themes. There was an addictive sense of progression to the process that continually drew me back in, and it also functions as something of a breather from the otherwise continuous loop of purging and boss battling and purging and boss battling. The rebuilding portion of Kunitsu-Gami's gameplay loop is certainly not perfect, and may prove too tedious for some, but there is some value to be found in the function it serves to complement the game's mechanics and overarching themes. And whether or not the game's overall repetitive nature will truly be an issue that will prevent the player from enjoying the experience will ultimately depend on the players themselves and their expectations going into the game, which I'll speak more on in my closing thoughts. If there's any element that will truly make or break the Kunitsu-Gami experience, it's the combat, and there's much to say on this topic, most of it good, but with a few notable caveats. As stated earlier, this is a third-person action/tactical RTS game, and you've probably worked out a good amount of what that means by now. The third-person action combat is performed by Soul, with some pretty standard mechanics and abilities for a combat system within the genre. Soul can perform a string of basic attacks that can be comboed with heavy attacks to produce special attacks that can be used in a variety of different scenarios to defeat a variety of different enemies. These heavy attack combos can also, at a later point in the game, be charged up for improved effectiveness. Soul also has access to a block mechanic, a dodge mechanic, and a bow attack. So a pretty standard set of third-person action combat elements. The game, on its face, doesn't really do anything particularly innovative or interesting. However, the true value of these elements comes from how effectively all these mechanics mesh with the tactical RTS elements to respond to unique threats posed by the diverse waves of Seath enemies, and it must also be noted that while these action-style mechanics are nothing new, they are done in a very well-polished manner. The tactical RTS elements of combat come in the form of assigning various kinds of combat roles to the villagers you rescue, who can then be commanded to defend key positions and attack enemies. It's a really simple system that's fairly easy to use, especially since you're never really given a very large number of units to command. I think the most I ever had in a given scenario was 12, with the least number being 4. So the tactical units you command tend to be on the smaller side, which is probably for the best, seeing as how it's a hybrid system that demands the player's attention be split between the RTS elements and the third-person action. Keeping unit sizes down helps to make commanding them more manageable under chaotic conditions. However, one of the glaring issues with the RTS mechanics is the positioning camera. The camera is used to give the player an overview of the battlefield and issue positioning commands to units. The problem is that this camera is permanently attached to SO, meaning you can't pan over to distant sections of the battlefield. If you want to precisely maneuver a unit that you positioned far from where SO happens to be at a given moment in a fight, you'll need to actually run close enough to where you want to position the unit in order to do so. This is an unnecessary limitation that holds the RTS gameplay back from being more deeply utilized and enjoyed. It's especially annoying once the game starts positioning multiple smaller torii gates around battlefields, which spawn additional enemies that the player will have to account for. Sometimes, predicting which smaller gate will be active from one night phase to another is impossible, leaving the player to respond by quickly adjusting unit positions to address new threats as they arise. Without a more versatile command camera, responding to such threats can be difficult and annoying, which might lead to players simply choosing to keep all of their units within one large group, thus limiting the potential depth of tactical gameplay. Overall, I'd say combat, even despite some of its issues, is very enjoyable. However, there is one major caveat that potential buyers of Kunitsu-Gami should be aware of. Some of the most interesting and in some cases even basic elements of the game's action combat mechanics are not even available until about halfway through the game, and we are talking about some very basic mechanics. These include SO's ability to perform block counterattacks, recover quickly from being knocked down, give more detailed command assignments to units, and even just use the basic bow attacks. Honestly, for the first half of the game, the action combat really felt like it was missing something, or more like a lot of something. And then you reach the middle point of the game and you're just flooded with a bunch of missing mechanics that really make SO feel like a fully fledged action combat protagonist. It is no doubt a strange choice for Capcom to have excluded these mechanics until so late in the game, only to push all of them on you all at once. I think this was done in the interest of encouraging the player to learn to utilize their villager units more and engage with the tactical combat in the early sections of the game, rather than simply powering through every fight using SO. And certainly, it is important to learn the RTS mechanics, as some of the later fights would be extremely difficult without relying heavily on both SO's action-oriented skills and the villagers' more tactically oriented capabilities. But even if that was Capcom's intention, it still makes me wonder if it wouldn't have instead been better to slowly introduce some of these very delayed mechanics at earlier points in the game, rather than thrusting them onto the player so late and so suddenly. So Kunitsu-Gami is a great game with fun combat set in an interesting world based on Japanese mythology, with a musical soundtrack that is equal parts enchanting and haunting, with just a dash of jazzy. And that's to say nothing about its performance. On my PC running at 4K with max settings, the game ran smooth as silk, never seeming to dip below 70 frames per second, and with not a single bug or glitch in sight after one full playthrough. That in and of itself deserves an award in today's modern games industry, in which buggy, unfinished messes has become the norm. But it also comes with the aforementioned shortcomings. The gameplay loop can be repetitive, the real-time strategy gameplay is unnecessarily limited, and the action gameplay feels notably shallow until it suddenly doesn't. Yet, despite all of these flaws, I would say that overall Kunitsu-Gami is an excellent game that knows exactly what it is and doesn't try to be anything more. We're talking about a title from a AAA developer that completely disregards all the norms of AAA development. It's a shorter game than you'd expect, taking me about 18 hours to complete my first playthrough. It's being sold for $50 or your regional equivalent in a games industry where the standard price point for a AAA game starts somewhere between $70 and $80. It's being sold as just a single standard version without any special gold, platinum, VIP special edition with a bunch of exclusive content, some of which you know they cut from the base game just to try and sell it to you at an extra cost. Frankly, it's surprising to see a game like this come from such a large publisher as Capcom, but you have to give credit where credit is due. They were willing to take the risk in producing a smaller, cheaper, less technically impressive title that just oozes passion and authenticity. And it's exactly these kinds of decisions that lead to the greater levels of innovation in an industry that is utterly defiled by the rank corruption of generic, uninspired development practices. What Capcom has done with this game is a net positive for the games industry and should be celebrated. And it's exactly these kinds of decisions that lead to greater levels of innovation in an industry that is utterly defiled by the rank corruption of generic, uninspired development practices. However, as to whether or not you, specifically, should buy this game depends on what you like and what you're looking for. If you're a longtime fan of wave defense games that utilize either action or RTS elements, and you like the aesthetic of the game, then I'd say this is an easy purchase for you at the base asking price. If, however, you have only a casual interest in the game or are concerned about any of the shortcomings I detailed in this review, then I think you should approach it with some sense of caution. For me personally, as more of a casual fan of the genre who happens to really enjoy elements of Japanese mythology in video games, I think the base price of $50 was a bit steep. For the content I received and the enjoyment I derived from it, I would have been much happier to have gotten the game at about a 20 to 40% discount or at about $30 to $40. So for those who, like me, are more casually inclined towards such a game, I'd recommend you wait for a sale. Well, that's it for my review of Kunitsu-Gami Path of the Goddess. I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it informative. Thanks for watching, everyone. This has been Adri with GroundedTake Gaming. As a friendly reminder, don't pre-order video games, and I hope you'll join me again next time.